Some call me Steve, Dad, husband, or friend. Others might call me boss, coach, or mentor. Today, you can call me the Leadership Hacker. Thanks for listening in. I really appreciate it. My job as the Leadership Hacker is to hack into the minds, experiences, habits, and learning of great leaders, C-suite executives, authors, and development experts so that I can assist you developing your understanding and awareness of leadership. I'm Steve Rush, and I'm your host today. I'm the author of Leadership Cake. I'm a transformation consultant and leadership coach, and can't wait to start sharing all things leadership with you. Dave McKeown is the special guest on today's show. He's the founder of Outfield Leadership, author of The Self-Evolved Leader, and a sought-after keynote speaker, leadership coach, and business growth advisor. But before we get a chance to speak with Dave, it's a Leadership Hacker News. We're going to turn our focus on having a light-hearted bit of news today. If you've ever missed the bus or the train or hit the snooze button many times, we asked some of our listeners about the funniest and craziest excuses for being late for work. This list of funny excuses is not exclusive, and we certainly haven't validated it, but it's funny nonetheless. So join us and listen in. So one of our listeners, we'll call her Sally, was invited to a birthday party. Now Sally and her colleagues have an hour for lunch usually, but on this day her co-worker asked if they'd cover for her, as she was off to a third birthday party. Sure, she replied, but just be back by 1:30 p.m. On returning late to work, her response was, "The third birthday party was my best friend's dog, and he got out, and we had to find him." Interesting one. Our next guest, and we'll call him Alan. He's an IT manager responsible for 36 programmers, a $1 billion company. And Al, in his spare time, raises llamas. Apparently. Al's excuse for showing up late was the fact his llama gave birth last night. Now, even funnier, he didn't even seem to think that this was a problem. Sick kids, funerals, they can't be avoided. But when mentioned to HR, my llama gave birth last night, I'm sure that would have been an interesting input into the data system. And the strangest, yet honest, email that anybody has ever sent to their boss is from one of our listeners called Michelle. Her response to her boss was, "I love heavy metal music so much." The email read, "Hi boss, I was waiting at the bus stop waiting to go home yesterday evening after work when I bumped into a lost Lithuanian heavy metal band with a crate of cider. After walking for several hours to help find their destination, I got a little bit tipsier than usual, and I'm very sorry, but I won't be able to make it in today. I hope this is okay." Can you just imagine how the boss might have responded in that situation? The reply was, "Okay." I wonder how that panned out overall. So if you do have any stories, insights that you'd like our listeners to hear, please get in touch. Dave McKeown is the CEO of Outfield Leadership. He's the author of The Self-Evolved Leader, Elevate Your Focus and Develop Your People in the World That Refuses to Slow Down. Dave, welcome to the Leadership Hacker podcast.
Steve, it is great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. So for folk that haven't met you yet and haven't got into your work, which they'll have an opportunity to do through our connection, how did an Irish lad end up in Laguna Beach, California?
I think I just got on the wrong plane one day and it landed. I was like, "Oh, this is nice." No. You know what? I think growing up in Belfast, where it rained every single day, I knew that there was somewhere in the world where the sun shone a little bit more, and I had a great opportunity about 10 years ago to move over to the States, first of all to Massachusetts, to join, actually funny enough, the family business. And then just as part of my own personal journey, met a wonderful girl who's now my wife, called Paris. And at some point about 6-7 years ago, we decided to trade in the snow of Massachusetts for the everlasting sunshine of Laguna Beach.
I can't think what the driving factor was. But I have been on the east coast of the US when it has snowed, and it's been minus 15 degrees centigrade, and understand that.
It's funny, the very first time it snows, you get really excited and you think this is brilliant, and then you realize that this is your life for 9 months and you have to dig your car out every morning. It's not so fun.
Yeah. Doesn't snow much in Laguna Beach though, right?
No, not at all. I don't know if it's ever snowed in Laguna Beach.
So what was the backstory in business that caused you to end up leading Outfield leadership?
So I started my career many moons ago back in the UK working for Accenture, which I'm sure you and your listeners are familiar with, huge global IT and services company, and really enjoyed it, enjoyed understanding what business was all about and how consulting worked and what leadership was about, what strategy was about, and very good initial start to my career, but always felt that I was somewhat of a very, 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 very small cog in a huge machine, and wanted to get the experience of actually working more closely with leaders and leadership teams to help them really drive through change. And so I had a great opportunity to join an organization called Predictable Success, which was started by my father many, many, many years ago. And Predictable Success is an organizational growth consulting and leadership development company. And I worked with him for about 4 years or so, really got an opportunity to see what it meant to work very closely with leadership teams, particularly of fast-growing businesses, to help them scale, and decided that that was the sort of work that I loved doing and wanted to do for the rest of my life. So about 5 years ago or so, stepped out of the family business and into my own and set up Outfield Leadership, and I've been doing that ever since.
Awesome. And what's the focus of the work that you and your folk at Outfield do right now?
At the minute, we're doing an awful lot of work of really trying to help leadership teams reset their strategic growth plans. You know, the last year to 18 months have thrown out, ripped up pretty much everybody's growth plans, no matter how hard hit or well a particular organization or industry's done as a result of the health and economic crisis. We're all in a position where we're trying to essentially rebuild from where we're at. So I've been doing a lot of work with leadership teams, helping them to essentially start from the ground up, which is to say, look, given the circumstances and the situation that we're in, who are we as an organization? Where do we want to go? What is our vision for a better world? And then how do we actually begin to start to take steps to get there? So it's this type of work that I enjoy doing the most. And so I've been fortunate and blessed to be able to do that right now.
And since the pandemic, it's fair to say that any strategy that was in place prior to January, February of last year has got to be rewritten, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a single industry or organization that hasn't been forced to rethink what they were doing. You know, there are some industries for whom last year, 18 months has been that great boon. You know, you look at companies that offer software as a service or virtual meeting software, Amazon. You know, there's a ton of organizations for whom it's been great from a business perspective, but most of us have really struggled to get a foothold on what's coming next. But even for those organizations for whom it's been, all things considered, a year of growth for them, every organization's in a position to rethink what is coming next and who we want to be and where we want to go. And so I can't imagine there's a single organization for whom their strategic plan from last January it remains untouched. Yeah. I think everybody's doing some massive rethinking.
I agree. Yeah. And as part of that rethinking, you and I had a business that would have involved being with clients on their sites, being shoulder to shoulder, and having to pivot that online. And you've done a perfect job of demonstrating how you can pivot a business model entirely online. So my hat's off to you firstly. But how challenging was that for you, if it was? And what have you learned from that experience?
Oh, well, thank you. I don't think it's perfect by any means, but it's certainly doing okay. You know, I think I was fortunate enough that about a quarter of the work that I was doing was online anyway before the pandemic. And so that gave me a bit of I was not flat-footed, I guess, in needing to make the shift. And funny enough, I think that, you know, you take the devastating nature of the cause of it, actually just take the problem of how do we translate in-person learning to an online environment. I actually really enjoyed that challenge. I've always, in all of the work that I've done, been very intentional about crafting really compelling experiences for people, because it's one thing to come together and, you know, have a day or a day and a half together and feel like, hey, that was a good session, but what did we really learn? And so just starting from the ground up and saying, well, how do you do strategic planning in a virtual world, or how do you do leadership training in a virtual world? How do we craft an experience that really takes into consideration both the limitations but also the tools that we have at our disposal? And I think it's been positive in that it's caused most, if not all of us, to elevate our game in a virtual world. And it means that from here on out, the excuse of, well, we can't get our people together virtually, it just doesn't work, I think is no longer valid. And so I think that being intentional about crafting that learning experience is just the starting point, no matter where you are. And we're going to have to do this again probably in 5 to 10 years, whenever we're put into much more of an augmented reality, a virtual reality scenario for training and development. We'll have to reimagine what that looks like for that environment. And we just approach that challenge with the same perspective.
And it's that thought around the experience that's most important, which I know you put an enormous amount of effort into. And I remember the old days of, overhead projectors, and we had to move away from those to then PowerPoint slides. That was kind of seen as amazing at the time.
Yeah. And, at the end of the day, we are the participants of our sessions. We are in a battle for their time and attention, and merely bringing people together just because it'll be quote unquote a helpful experience does not make it so. And actually, if you look at building learning experiences for people, you've got to take them through a journey in much the same way that you would for another form of entertainment, whether that's a movie or a musical theater or even a concert. Sometimes people often the big key questions that they need to answer for themselves are, why am I here? What am I going to learn? And what do you need from me to give into this session? And if you can begin to answer those stories for your participants and then start to take them on a real journey of their own learning, that's how you get to the end of a session with a really positive experience for everybody involved.
Absolutely. Love that. So congratulations, your book, The Self-Evolved Leader, has just had its first birthday. So congratulations on that milestone.
Thank you.
What was the inspiration behind the book?
I wanted to take the work that I'd been doing with leadership teams and memorialize it in some way, I guess, and build some, at least an initial starting point of a body of work. It's the first book that I've written. And I guess there were two aspects of it. One was slightly selfish and one was less selfish. The less selfish aspect is, it's much more scalable in terms of the impact that you can have on people if they can partake in some asynchronous learning where they'll just pick up a book and flick through it whenever they want. Doesn't require my time and attention to be in front of them versus, a workshop with 20, 25, 30 people. There's only so many of them you can do at a time. And so it really helped to increase or scale the impact that I can have. And then the second part, the slightly selfish one, was just wanting to memorialize and start to build a body of work. And also, it gets to the point in the industry that I'm in where, funny enough, people start asking you, well, do you have a book? Despite the fact that, teaching and training and consulting is very different than writing. For some reason, we have kind of conflated the two together and said, well, if you're going to come and work with us, you better have written these thoughts down somewhere. So that was kind of another sub reason for getting the book out.
It's an interesting dynamic, though. I guess that what you talked about a little earlier around that constructing the story for people to go on a journey in a learning world or a leadership development world, it's probably very similar. When you start to write that book, you still have that mindset of, how do I involve people in my learning and help them on that journey, right?
Oh, very much so. And I think that the best non-fictional books have a narrative thread through them in just the same way that a fictional book would. And, one of the things that I wanted to avoid was, that old perspective on business books that it could have been an article or it could have been a blog post or it could have been, a 12-page PDF where there's one central theme and then the author just hammers it home in 12 different chapters with a slightly nuanced version of it. I wanted to avoid that. So I really did want it to take the leader on a journey and the reader on a journey and help them build their own leadership through each each chapter in a positive way, rather than just saying, well, here's my one point again and again and again and again.
And the journey that you take folk on through the self-evolved leader has 3 steps almost, and you call it the vision step, the pulse step, and the discipline step. Maybe be useful for our listeners just to get a sense of what each of those steps mean.
Sure, happy to. Let me just peel a layer back or elevate a little bit to I guess set the context for why these steps are important. The overarching theme and thrust of the book is that tagline that you read at the beginning of the episode, which is how to elevate your focus and develop your people in a world that refuses to slow down. And the reality is that our world is moving so quickly that our leaders are basically just going in and firefighting or putting out crises or just winning the day and barely keeping our heads above water long enough to really think about the long-term direction of their team. And so what I wanted to do was to give some encouragement and some very practical steps on how to elevate your focus, how to spend more time thinking about the long-term direction of your team and the development of your people. In order to do that, I've seen the best leaders walk through these 3 steps. The first one is to create a compelling vision with your team. And by the way, the book is written for leaders at any level of an organization, from a frontline supervisor all the way up to a CEO. So it doesn't matter where you're at, you can really guide your team using it. We often confuse vision in our teams in terms of assuming that it's wrapped up or it's embodied in the team leader, and that's not generally the case, or I think it's certainly shifting. I think we're getting more and more to a point in a position where we need to create with our teams a compelling vision of where we're going, so that we're all bought into the journey, the destination, the impact that we want to have, the value that we bring as a team. Definitely. And once you're able to create that with your team, that gives you somewhat of a fixed North Star, at least for a period of time that you're working towards. You can use it as a rallying cry. You can use it as a touch point for making decisions, and just an anchor point for where we're going. And if you think about firefighting and being in the weeds and the tactical stuff that we fight every day, if you set a compelling vision with your team, it sets as an anchor point kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum for that. It always tries to help you pull up. So once you set your vision, the next step is to do something that feels much less interesting and compelling, but it's just as, if not equally important, which is to build your implementation pulse to get there. So it's fun to sit in a room and talk with our team about where we're going. It's less fun to sit in a room with our team and say, well, what are the specific initiatives and experiments that we want to try? What are the shorter term goals that we need that will help us build towards that? What is the meeting rhythm and cadence to ensure that we're coming back to review our progress? What's our process for ensuring that we remain agile whenever new bits of information come in? And most leaders, unfortunately, handle that in a very reactive way. So, a customer calls to threaten to pull their business, or there's a change in the market, or something dramatic happens, and we'll scramble to try to figure out what's going on. So I encourage leaders to build a proactive implementation pulse that kind of gets you a little bit ahead of that game. You can see some of the leading indicators coming. So you've got your vision, then you've got of where you're going, you've got your implementation pulse of how to get there with your team. And then the third part is really to build a series of key disciplines that you need as a leader to navigate the boat to get there. It's one thing to get your crew along with you, set your destination, set all of the ports along the way. But if you don't know how to steer the ship or put the sail up or clean the decks, then you're going to struggle. So I think that there are a series of leadership disciplines that are becoming more and more important for our leaders today. And that's the final part of the book, just describing some of those.
I love the simplicity behind those 3 steps, because actually one feeds the other, then feeds the other. And right. You can't operate without either of them, can you?
No, they almost all they sort of fit together in a circle. They touch on each other, and you work on one, and then you'll work on another, and you realize, oh well, I need to tweak that a little bit, and maybe I'll tweak that in order to make that happen. And it's sort of as close to a holistic model of leadership as I could express.
Sure. And one of the things that you work at as part of that disciplines, and you intimated it a little earlier, it's around dragging people out of the weeds and getting them to think more strategically. So if I'm listening to this, what does that really mean?
So one of the things that I think culturally we've got into, which is a little problematic, is this belief that a leader's job is to know the answers, to show the way, or to save the day. And that's come about for a couple of reasons. One, we've just been rewarded throughout our entire life, from school all the way up to first job, first promotion, on being the one that knows the answers or saves the day. That's just typically how, we get a pat on the back. And secondly, it feels good. It feeds our ego whenever we jump in to save the day and help our team out of a pickle. We feel wanted, useful, and valuable, and needed, and so there's just a little bit of an endorphin hit as a result of that. The problem with that is that over time, your people end up developing learned helplessness, which is rather than trying to think for myself or even begin to start to work out the solution to this problem, I'll just go leave it at my boss's door, because at the end of the day, they're just going to step in and fix it anyway or tell me what to do anyway. So I stop thinking for myself. And then on the flip side of that, the leader starts to get frustrated because they're the bottleneck, because the more that they do it, the more they have to save the day. And eventually they're looking at their team saying, gosh, what happened to these people? They used to be so competent. They used to be able to, think for themselves, and now they're also dependent on me. To which my response is almost always, well, you got to look in the mirror, because you're at least, if not more than 50% of that equation. Where I think leaders can be really effective is to break out of that cycle of mediocrity, move towards a cycle of excellence, which is all about focused on where a leader truly adds value. We think we add value there, but we don't. Where we truly add value is in the long-term direction of our team and the development of our people. So thinking about what's coming down the pike next quarter, next year, and trying to help chart a course through that, whilst looking at our team and assessing, okay, well, where are we strongest and where are some of our development points? How do I grow this team so that eventually at some point, if I wasn't in the room, this would be a really high-performing team that wasn't dependent on me. And so that's the key behavioral shift that I'm trying to induce here, is away from that day-to-day firefighting in the weeds, where we think we add value, towards more strategic long-term thinking and the development of our people, where ultimately in the long run will add the most value.
And in order to do that, we've got to create empowerment in our teams in order for them to start thinking more strategically too. How would you go about that?
It's a funny and often asked question, and we usually want to just tackle that. So how do we empower our team? To which my perspective is always, well, I mean, we can start there, but the empowerment of your team is going to last as long as, it used to be, depending on how good the lunch was that we served during the session. The problem is that the lack of empowerment in a team is a symptom and not a cause of a whole bunch of other stuff. We think it's a cause. And so we actually need to start backing it up and saying, okay, well, how do we begin to fix this? And first of all is you got to, like any behavioral shift, you got to make a mindset shift away from being a leader that's stuck in the weeds in that cycle of mediocrity, towards a leader that wants to focus on helping my team achieve our shared goals, and in doing so to become the best version of themselves. We start there and then work through those steps that we talked about: building a vision with your team, building the implementation pulse, building your own key disciplines as a leader. It's only until and unless we start doing that the empowerment will start coming back into our team. You can't enforce empowerment into a team. Nobody can force somebody to take ownership and accountability. What we can do as leaders is create the environment in which people want to be empowered and they want to take ownership and accountability. But depending on how acute and how long we've sort of resided in that day-to-day firefighting, that cycle of mediocrity, it can take anywhere from 6 to 12 to maybe even 18 months in a team to really restore a sense of empowerment. And it all starts with the leader taking those steps that we talked about before people start to realize, oh, okay, that things are different now. Actually, I do feel empowered now.
Some of those behaviors also could be just unlearning and having a discipline of unlearning old behaviors and relearning new behaviors.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, Marshall Goldsmith, who's a big author and executive coach out here in the States, wrote a book called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And I think one of the saddest things that I see is whenever a leader gets to, a fairly prominent position, maybe it's mid-level or even director level or above, but they basically draw a line under their learning and say, well, everything that I did to get me here will stand me in good stead to get me to the next stage. And at some point, funny enough, all of those great things that did get us to a certain point in our career actually end up becoming liabilities, and they start to detract the value that we make. And I think that there are a number of key pivotal points in our leadership journey where we do almost need to unlearn everything that we had learned before, and at least just take a step back and evaluate what's working and what's not working, in order to be intentional about how we need to show up to get to that next stage in our own growth and development.
Yeah, I love that. And of course, part of us finding new ways of working and new behaviors is unlocking that creative gene that we all have, but for some reason we seem to grow out of, or at least many of us grow out of. You call this out really as something that we need to focus on as part of those disciplines, and creating that headspace to get creative. Tell us a little bit about how I might do that if I'm a leader.
Well, the first thing I think is to realize the point that you're making, which is, we have, I don't know how it's, I mean, I do know how it's happened, but culturally we've sort of assigned creativity to people that are just naturally creative, or, creative geniuses. And it's kind of nonsense.
Yeah.
You look at anybody that's really creative and they'll tell you this is not something that necessarily naturally happens to me. In fact, Stephen King said in one of his books, don't wait for the muse. He talks about this not being the spirit world. It's just another job, and equates it to like laying pipe or driving long haul trucks. And so many creative folks out there in a whole bunch of fields say creativity is just a process that I go through. And so we've got to understand that we can all build a degree of creativity. Now, we're not all going to be Stephen King, of course, but it is something in there that we can develop. Now, the thing is, if our brain is filled with our most imminent to-dos, or whatever the most recent ping is on the myriad ways that somebody can communicate with me, I think research is starting to show that we have somewhat of a finite amount of processing power in our brain to really handle stuff. David Allen, who's a time management expert, had a great quote, which was, our brain is for having ideas, not holding them. And too many leaders just spend too much of their brain cycles, their psychic RAM, just with whatever's front and center. And there's no way that we can address the process of thinking creatively whenever that's the case. And so we've got to find a good way. One of the disciplines I talk about is managing your attention. Got to find a way to deal with that in the appropriate forum, so that we can free up some of that psychic RAM, so that we can sit down and actually work through a process that allows us to think creatively about the long-term direction of our team and development of our people.
The other thing that Headspace gives us as well is we're able to face into the reasons why that intention gets stuck. You probably face into that quite a bit, right?
Oh, very much so. I think also just intentionality is so important. Because of the fast pace and the requirements on our leaders today, often a lot of the decisions that we make are just very reactive, and we're not actually intentional about a whole range of things, whether it's sitting down to think creatively or strategically, or even just walking into a meeting. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is just the power of taking a pause. We are just on this call and response mode in our organizations, and sometimes the best thing to do is just take a beat and take a moment of silence, and don't just go with the first thing that comes to mind, but actually take that silence, reflect on your intention, and then respond accordingly to that.
I love it. And also, if we've got a habit and a discipline that says this is the way I operate, and I'm going to react, then that whole taking stock is a new discipline.
Mm-hmm. Very much so, for sure. And then you get to separate yourself out from your ego a little bit, and you get to reflect on, well, okay, how do I show up, and what does work well and what doesn't work well? And, maintaining curiosity about those sorts of things, about how you show up, allows you to assess in a much more objective light just the impact that has, without feeling the need to be overly defensive, or even, running through a lot of that negative self-talk that we often get ourselves. If we can remain curious about the impact of our behavior long enough to see that through, we can start to see some really beneficial behavioral changes.
Of course, I guess creativity looks for solutions rather than anchoring into problems as well.
Yeah, very much so. And So often we don't take that approach in how we view ourselves. We're not trying to solve problems. We're not trying to find solutions. We're just trying to beat ourselves up or beat a situation up or beat somebody else up because of the situation that we've found ourselves in, rather than flipping that on its head, like you said, and say, well, look, all we're trying to do here is we're just a group of people trying to make the world a better place or trying to, find some solutions. So let's take that positivity. Let's take that objectivity into our discussions and our decisions and our meetings and how we show up.
So, Dave, at this part of the show, our listeners are familiar with. This is where we get to spin a little and I get to hack into your leadership mind. And of all the years and experiences you have, I'm going to ask you to call out what you think your top 3 leadership hacks might be.
Okay, so number 1, I alluded to, which is get a hold of your attention management. And I think the best thing that you can do actually is narrow the amount of inputs that come into your day-to-day workflow. We have allowed too many inputs and it's getting really, really difficult to manage. And whatever has your attention is basically where you're going to put most of your energy and effort. Second thing is to get really good at asking the question, what do you think? I think that it's one of the most powerful leadership questions that you can have in your arsenal. It really helps bolster empowerment and reflection in your team and reduces the reliance on you. So get really comfortable just asking people, what do you think? And then thirdly, get really comfortable with silence. Let silence do the heavy lifting on a lot of instances. Don't feel like it's your job or your need or your requirement to fill that silence. And that can range in a whole bunch of situations, whether it's waiting for somebody to talk or share their perspective, or whether it's giving some, difficult or constructive feedback. Just letting silence do the heavy lifting can be super powerful.
Really powerful, that last one too, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it is uncomfortable. I was on a Zoom workshop just this afternoon, and as a result of me just sat there looking at the camera, it's just a matter of time before somebody's going to break the silence because nobody likes it.
Yeah.
But actually, that's where the great discovery starts to happen.
Very much so. And but I think we fear as leaders that, well, number one, we feel like, gosh, this silence is lasting forever, which in reality it's not. It's probably like 3 seconds. Yeah. But number 2, we fear that it reflects badly on us if there's silence for some strange reason. It's the leader's job or whoever's in charge of that meeting to keep things going, and we've robbed ourselves of that room to just let things breathe a little bit. And I think it's a really powerful skill for any leader to learn, to be able to sit and rest in that silence for a beat or two longer.
Yeah, great stuff. Next thing we have is called hack to attack. So this is typically where something in your life or your work hasn't worked out. It might have even been an experience that's been quite adverse in your life. But as a result of the experience, though, you now use it as a positive in what you do. What would your hack to attack be?
So it was pretty tough and difficult moving away from the family business. That was a particularly rough period of time for a whole bunch of reasons, which I'm sure you can imagine. Family business is difficult enough as it is. And it was definitely a soul-searching time for me. And I was definitely trepidatious about taking what I had learned and trying to build something out on my own. But I was also excited about doing it. I knew that I could. And I was just talking to my wife about this the other day, that I learned a whole bunch during that time of my life, but I've also learned a whole bunch more since then. And I think I'm better at what I do as a result of some of those challenges, and also just some of the experiences that I've had in the last 3 or 4 years where I have been on my own. And I think that it's helped me enormously professionally. It's also helped me just personally get a true understanding of who I am and what I hope to achieve in this life. So negative situations are not often going to stay that way. And it's really about how you approach it and those lessons that you want to glean from it.
It's the old adage of not the event, but how you react to it, right?
For sure. Very much so.
And the last thing we want to do, Dave, is take you on a bit of time travel.
All right.
So we're going to get you to bump into Dave at 21 and you get to give him some advice. What would your advice to Dave be?
I know, funny enough, I don't think 21-year-old Dave would listen to Dave of the future. He'd probably take one look at me and go, where you go. I was a little too cocksure at that point in my life. Funny enough, I do think it would have been hard for me to take anything really transformative about life or how I showed up or how I approached things, because it was very obstinate just in my own worldview at the time, which has thankfully since changed. The one thing, funny enough, I think I would have said or would have encouraged me to do at 21 would have been to keep playing the guitar. I played the guitar as a teenager right up until I was about 20 or 21. I really enjoyed it. And then I put it down for 15 years and didn't really pick it up again until about 6 months ago. And I've spent the last 6 months, on one hand, really enjoying the journey of trying to relearn everything that I'd forgotten. On the other hand, really frustrated that I had 15 years where if I had been playing for 15 years, I'd be some sort of virtuoso now. So I would have just encouraged myself, that creative endeavor, to have not put it down for so long and just to see where I could have got to with it.
I love that. And also the whole principle of having stuff that's not your work stuff, that is helping you learn new things, create new practice disciplines and stuff. There's always a parallel that you can read back to how it's helping you in the core way that you show up.
Oh, hugely. And I think probably just a lesson that I'm just scratching the surface of. I think from 21-year-old Dave up until probably 6 to 8 months ago, the sole focus in my subconscious and what I was striving for was all work related. I don't know whether I would necessarily have voiced it in that way during that time, but looking back on it now, it's really clear that that was the case. And that, back to that old conversation was great because it got me to some really good, powerful places. But I reached a point about 8 months ago where it was starting to become a hindrance and a liability, and just exploring some of those other areas of life that won't necessarily quote unquote amount to anything, but you just do it for the sake of doing it. So picking up the guitar and learning a new scale or a new song, or practicing something over and over again, it allows you to, like you say, apply that to just a whole bunch of other different areas of your life. And I mean, I hope from here on out that I'll continue to pursue some of those creative endeavors, even if it doesn't amount to anything, because it does round out your perspective in the work that you do.
Yeah, it definitely does. So for folk listening in, Dave, want to find a little bit more about the work you do, and indeed maybe get hold of a copy of The Self-Evolved Leader, where should we send them?
If you want to find out about what I do around strategic planning and leadership development, go to outfieldleadership.com. outfieldleadership.com. And if you're interested in the book, go to selfevolvedleader.com, and there'll be a link to everywhere that you can buy it.
Awesome. And we'll make sure they're in the show notes as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Dave, thanks for coming on the show. I love talking with you. And every time that I do speak with you, I just get this sense of energy, which is awesome in what you do. So thanks for sharing that with our listeners, and thanks for being part of our community on the Leadership Hacker podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on, Steve. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave. I genuinely want to say a heartfelt thanks for taking time out of your day to listen in too. We do this in the service of helping others and spreading the word of leadership. Without you listening in, there would be no show. So please subscribe now if you haven't done so already. Share this podcast with your communities and network, and help us develop a community and a tribe of leadership hackers. And finally, if you'd like me to work with your senior team, your leadership community, keynote an event, or you would like to sponsor an episode, please connect with us via our social media. And you can do that by following and liking our pages on Twitter and Facebook. Our handle there is @LeadershipHacker. Instagram, you can find us there at @the_leadership_hacker. And at YouTube, we're just Leadership Hacker. So that's me signing off. I'm Steve Rush, and I've been the Leadership Hacker.